Hello and welcome back to our series of lectures on Humanism in the 21st century. Today we're dealing with a very important chapter, chapter 4, in which we start to deal with a new phenomenon from the Platonic point of view. So we've been looking at the last 2,500 years of thought as it's been influenced by Plato and his theory of eidos. We've looked at the ramifications of those concepts and how they have been taken up by other important thinkers along the way, and shaped many of our concepts of personal identity, concepts of selfhood, and many facets of the modern world that we live in. It's important to recognize that in none of this early philosophy was there a consideration of the main way that we communicate. In fact, the very structure of communication itself was not a topic of conversation until the early 20th century, when we discovered linguistics, the scientific study of language, which turns out to relate to a larger system of how we use signs in general. So language is a subset of the larger structure of what's called semiotics, how we use signs to communicate in every single way. So today we're going to be taking a very important turn away from Plato, and this will help us understand the tremendous gap that has opened between Platonic philosophy of eidos, the theory of stable identity, and the notions of how we, as humans, use sign systems in order to enact one of the major functions of being human, right? The process of communication, thought, the way that language is embedded in our very psychology, right? Try thinking without language and you'll very quickly get a sense for just how important this distinction is. It's remarkable to say, but in the early 20th century, we first started to notice that we were born without language. It seems rather obvious, but as I've pointed out, there is a startling lack of consideration of children all the way up until the 18th century, right? Into the 19th century, we start to get pedagogical theories, concepts that children are actually different and therefore learn differently. And then in the 20th century, we add this piece, right? A child is called an infant when it's first born. It actually comes from the Latin word infans, which means without language. So we've known, of course, that children don't have language when they're born, but we've never considered that an important phenomenon. That is until the work of Ferdinand de Saussure, who in his course in general linguistics starts to outline the basic premises that are now foundational to our theory of linguistics and science systems in general. Saussure's work is academic, it's dry, it's scientific, so it's not fun to read, but it's remarkable in its import and its impact. It's foundational to many of our assumptions in the 20th century, not just about language, but about the very concept of what it means to be human. So I want to carefully introduce some of his basic ideas. This will not be a course in linguistics. This will be a course today in sign systems, but we need this foundational structure that Saussure first introduced. In terms of his observations about language, he started by carefully looking at signs. So any language that we use is composed of a sign, and that normally for us would be something like the word tree, right? Could be any word at all, but you'll recall we've been talking about trees in terms of Plato's concept of eidos, so we've heard his idea, his concept of how that works. Now let's turn to the linguistic structure. If I say the word tree, then what Saussure observed off the bat is that, in fact, there are two components there. On the one hand, there's the sound, which he calls the signifier. And on the other hand, there's the thing that I mean by the sound, the signified. We'll go over this a little bit more later on. But for now, let's just think about this. When I say tree, if you're a native English speaker, then you have no problem automatically moving from the sound to the meaning. But when you're learning a foreign language, of course, you know that that is detached, right? You hear a sound, but you don't attach it to that meaning automatically. So we do know that those are two separate things. The other observation that Saussure makes at the beginning is that both of those attributes are arbitrary. That word arbitrary is very important for Saussure. What he means by that is that it is in no way grounded in the reality of the world that we live in. A tree is itself a part of reality, but our sign system for describing that is arbitrary in the sense that it is not attached to the actual real tree. Why do I say that? Well, first of all, Think about the sound systems that we use. We know something important about language, which is that there are multiple languages in the world. No particular language is either right or wrong. Of course, again, if you've normalized your language and you hadn't studied any other languages, perhaps it would seem that your language was the natural one. But the problem is anybody speaking anything else, Chinese, Arabic, it doesn't matter, could make the same argument, right? That's because the sounds that we use are arbitrary. They're not attached to any particular thing, but they are associated with social convention. In other words, the reality that language takes on has to do with our social agreements about language. If I say tree and you think tree, we're good, right? But if I say arbol and you don't think tree, then you've lost that sound concept connection, signifier signified connection there. That's because those are not organically or naturally connected. They're a social convention, and therefore they're arbitrary. Moving on to the concept, the signified, that's supposed to be indicated by the sound or the signifier. This is also a very interesting one, right? And this brings us back to the notion of ethology, which we talked about in chapter 3. If I say tree, there's a sound, and you're supposed to associate it with tree, but what tree exactly? Not a particular tree. I'm assuming that you're not thinking of a particular tree. And that's because we generally assume that we're talking about the same thing. And yet you know that communication is messy. If I'm talking about a particular tree, you might not actually understand that. So let's be more specific. Let's say that we're walking in a forest and I point to a tree right in front of us and I say, look at that tree. What's interesting here is that you will see the tree and I will see the tree. But are we actually seeing the same tree? In some ways, yes, and Plato, I think, there would really want to insist on that. And yet, again, if we start looking at those differences, do we really see the tree in the same way? For example, I really like to climb trees, and when I was in California, I climbed redwood trees, and those are very tall. So something I know about trees that not everybody knows is that if you climb high enough, you realize that they're moving all of the time. They're in motion. They look stable and steady to us from the ground, but they're actually not. So ethologically speaking, my world, my perceptual reality is in that way different from somebody who, say, doesn't like to climb trees or has never been up a tree, who might not know that. Think about it again from other perspectives. If you have somebody who is an arborist, somebody who professionally cuts and trims trees and looks at the tree health, right? They would know more about that tree than either you or I because they'd be looking at it from a different ethological perspective. And so on with biology, or somebody who grew up in a different part of the world, right? If you've never seen a redwood, then they're quite remarkable, but you could say the same thing if we traveled to, say, Japan or Australia, right? We'd see different kinds of trees that we're less familiar with. So the ethology, the world that we live in, the embodied perceptual perspective that we take on, actually shapes that signified, that concept. And that is equally, therefore, arbitrary to the sound. So we have two elements in this sign. When I say tree, I mean signifier and signified, sound and concept. But both of those, in different ways, are not attached to reality. The word for reality for Saussure is the referent. The referent would be the real thing that actually would be there. And what we're going to discover in this discussion is that linguistics starts to uncover an important fact about our world, which is that our mode of communication and representation of that world is not the same as the world itself. It may be part of it. Hopefully it is if we're accurate with our language, but it never encompasses the entirety of that experience. Let's say, for example, that I know everything there is humanly to know about a tree. Already, if you're paying attention, you notice that's probably impossible, right? But there are other ways besides the human's ways to understand a tree, and this is the problem with ethology, right? We can never understand a tree the way an ant does, or a bird does, or a fox that may burrow or use it for food may. And the reasons for that is that our interested perspective in the world always shapes the limited scope of what we need to know about it. And the idea that we can encompass all of the reality of the tree is simply unrealistic. So when we use these representational signs, like the word tree, we're using a kind of a shorthand, and that shorthand is really functional, it's really useful, and yet it causes us a really important problem, which is that we dismiss the differences in our perceptual reality when we use sign systems. Say that another way, sign systems are full of differences, and those differences can either be dismissed in the Platonic structure, and you are perfectly welcome to do that. We've been doing it for 2,500 years. But what we found in the 20th century is that if you take those differences seriously and really think about what we're excluding as well as what we're including when we communicate, then an entirely different perceptual reality starts to open up. We start to recognize that those differences are not only significant, but they are decisive in the way that we create meaning. So to sum up this first slide, and this is very important, Saussure is able to observe that the split between the referent and the sign means that reality and language are two separate things. Everybody wants to get to reality. This is not a joyous observation in terms of science, but it's the most realistic one that we have. And the reason that it's important to take this into account is that this is based on scientific observation, the science of linguistics, and it's structurally something that we can test. It's a hypothesis that we can test. And by testing that, what we found is that language for us is not actually a tool that describes reality. It describes culture. That is the distinction that we've been working towards in this class. So I want to give you an example of how a sign works. Notice over here on the left, we have the concept and the sound, the signifier and the signified. I want to concretize that in a Valentine's Day rose so that we can get an example. I like to call these structures metaphors, right? A metaphor, as you'll recall from your high school English class, is a direct comparison between two unlike things. And we do this with quite a bit of language. In fact, I think that along with Nietzsche, I would argue that all language, every single thing that we do in language, and every single thing we do in our sign systems is fundamentally a metaphor. Why is that? Well, because a representation is never the thing that we're representing. If it were, we would not need representation in the first place. I'll say that again. Representation cannot be the thing that we're representing. Otherwise, we wouldn't need representation at all. Again, if that sounds a little mind-bendy, that's because of our Platonic inheritance. This is actually quite an obvious observation in a way. So let me illustrate it just so we're all on the same page. I have a Valentine's Day rose. It's a red rose, and I'm going to give it to my partner. The reason that I give it to my partner is that I expect my partner to understand exactly what that rose means, right? What's interesting about the rose, though, of course, is that the rose does not only have qualities that are directly associated with romance, right? So flowers are beautiful. That fits with romance. The red equals passion. Okay, for our culture, that's true, although not for all cultures. And so on, right? That's why it's a symbol, a representation. But what does not fit in that rose's reality with the expression that I want to give it? Well, many things, right? For example, it can have thorns. Hopefully it's been dethorned, but there are other problems as well. For example, it's going to die within the week, right? I paid money for it, and I certainly don't want my partner to think that my love is going to last only for a week or that it's worth $5.99 at the local grocery store. I don't want that person to think about any of those things precisely because I want them only to find the right meaning, and right is in quotation marks there, right? Because what I'm really asking that person to do is to exclude some information in order to get to the right interpretation. Now, if you're following closely here, you notice that something remarkable is going on. That means that when we communicate, what we're really relying on the other person to do is not only include the information that we're saying, but exclude parts of what we're saying that do not fit with our intention. That is a good reason for explaining why communication is such a mess. And in fact, in our daily lives, we do know that communication is a mess, right? In our active conversations, we say things again, we say things in different ways, we repeat ourselves, we come back to older conversations, we break off in the middle, somebody stops to ask questions. It's not easy to communicate. And if you'd ever like to engage in a practice of this in a self-conscious manner, try going to a cafe or a bar or a pub or wherever you like to hang out socially where people are talking a lot, and just eavesdrop a little bit. Not to the content of their conversation, that would be rude. Think about the process of communication that they're undergoing, though. It's a mess. They interrupt, sentences are broken off, partial ideas are brought up again and again. And this structure of communication, the messiness, is sometimes something that we take on as a responsibility of our own. It's our fault if we don't communicate, or it's the other person's fault if they don't communicate effectively to us. And yet, what we can start to see with Saussurean linguistics is that the structural problems of communication themselves actually are to blame for these issues in communication that we're always engaged in. That's because this wonderful system of representation is not the reality that we're describing. It's something different from the reality. X does not equal Y in this metaphorical structure. The red rose can never actually fully, consummately express the love that I feel for another person. Even take the direct word or phrase, I love you. Right? I love you is a very powerful phrase. It's something that we all say to various people at various points in our life. Does that word really encompass all of the ways that you feel about them? Quite obviously not. Our expression of our lives, the way we engage in them, are so profoundly removed from the reality that we want to express that we find ourselves constantly frustrated by that process. And here I want to turn back to chapter 3 and think about how language can impact on some of our assumptions about selfhood as well. Think about the phrase I am, and you can add whatever you want. I am tired, I am hungry, I am happy. It doesn't really matter. As soon as you say I am, you've created another one of these metaphors. You're using the word I to stand in for all of the complexity and difference that encompasses you. And even though you're very different from the person sitting next to you, you're both using the same word. So you're counting on the person who's hearing you say I to include all the right things and exclude all the right things. But if you were to really try to articulate what those differences are, do you think even with an infinite vocabulary and infinite time that you could actually express it? Maybe you do feel that way. I certainly don't. I certainly find that language is vastly inadequate to expressing my world and my experience. And if you agree with that, then you're starting to follow Saussure's problematic here. Let's look at it in terms of some items that we've already checked out in this class. Take, for example, the Magritte painting, which we discussed early on. Down below, the French language there says, this is not a pipe. And what Magritte, the painter in the early 20th century, is really getting at here is that when we have a representation of something, it's not the same as the thing itself, precisely what Saussure ends up arguing. So if you look at this pipe, it looks like a pipe. Why wouldn't it be a pipe? Well, quite clearly it's not in a way, right? It's a painting of a pipe. And if we start to conceptualize those representations as separate from the things that we're talking about, then we're starting to get to the point of the issue. If we take this into the realm of subjectivity, think back to Jacques Lacan's theory of the mirror stage, which we introduced last chapter, we start to see that Lacan also is aware of this problem. When a baby sees itself in the mirror, it's creating a sign for itself. That is me. And that ideal self, that imago, can never be the same as the actual ego. Why? Because the ego is full of differences and complexities, right? We are messy. We are full of those differences. But the image that we have of ourselves as a coherent entity moving forward in life, always the same subject, those ideas are ideals. They're signs for ourselves. And that sign and the reality of our experience are two separate things. We struggle to adequate them, just like we do in all representational models. But we know also now that we can never get there because of something that constitutes the very process of representation itself. So the mirror stage is an important example to think about when we're dealing with this notion of selfhood, but it ties in now to this larger conversation about representation and language. So Saussure concludes that language is not a system of representation of sameness, it's a system of differences. And he means that in several different ways. I want to take another step more deeply into the idea of linguistics, right, the science of linguistics, so that we can get an idea for exactly what Saussure means when he says that language is a system of differences. The first way to encounter this concept is with what's called a phoneme. A phoneme is the smallest meaningful unit of sound in a language. If you look at these phrases here, bat, cat, and mat, what's really important here is not the AT sound, the at, which is repeated in each case. But as a native English speaker, you are actually mentally dismissing that repeated sound, the at, because that's meaninglessly the same. What you're actually picking up on are the phonemes, the differences that make a difference. The b, the k, and the m sounds. Those are meaningful units of sound because they make the difference for us. Now, I said earlier that different languages are structured similarly, but they're equally arbitrary. One of the important ways that we can see this function is to notice that different phonemes matter differently for different languages. So if you've ever heard a foreign language with which you have no familiarity whatsoever, it's probably sounded like an infinite string of sounds just going on, and you can't differentiate any things that we would think of as words. That's because you're missing those phonemic differences. The sounds that do matter are slipping by because you're not aware of how that language is structured. And if you do speak more than one language, then you can think about this for yourself, right? Different sounds matter differently in different languages, and some sounds don't even exist in different languages, right? A classic example would be the R. An American R is very relaxed in the back of the mouth. A French R is guttural, and a German R is even more guttural still, whereas a Spanish or an Italian R is a trill. And those distinctions there that we get don't exist in American English, but they do exist in other languages. Those phonemes are differences for those languages, but they're not differences for us. So at the very level of sound, we're already structured as a language according to difference. Now moving on from the signifier, the sound, to the signified again, we have yet another issue of difference that we can explore. And this one, to give you a heads up, actually matters more than the phonemic difference, than the sound differences. So when we say something like a dog or cat, right, we're not only using phonemic differences to distinguish, we're using conceptual differences to distinguish. How is, for example, a cat different from a dog? Well, it's actually easy if we think of them contrastively, create a binary between the two, right? Let's say, for example, that we want to define what a cat is. Well, we can do that one of two ways. We can say it's different from, and then name something else, another domestic animal. And one of the classic binaries that we have in our culture is between cat people and dog people, by which we mean to designate the characteristics of cats and dogs. We can do this, of course, with other animals as well. It doesn't really matter. The point is here that rather than define what a cat actually is, we're talking about what a cat is not. In other words, we're defining things within language through difference. Let's say instead that we seek to use words or sign systems to define a cat. After all, that really is our only other tool. So let's say I want to say what a cat is. I'll look it up in a dictionary, right? If I look something up like a cat in a dictionary, then maybe I see that it's a small domesticated carnivorous mammal, etc. Rather technical stuff. Let's say that when I'm reading that, I don't know what domesticated means, right? If I look up the word domesticated in order to understand what the definition of cat is, and in that word domesticated, it has another word that I don't know, what do I do then? Well, I look up that word, right? And when we're starting to learn language as children, this is exactly the sea of relative meaning that we find ourselves in. One word hangs on another. Rather than attaching to reality at some point, these dictionary definitions are simply a sea of words that defer meaning. So the way that I can define a cat in this context really boils down to just two different techniques. I can differentiate it, noticing the differences between cats and dogs, or I can defer it. I can just keep on using more and more words to try to get around to what that cat is. The philosopher Jacques Derrida observed that we are really stuck with these two strategies. And he came up with the French phrase différence to kind of encompass both of these structures. So when we try to say what a cat is, we can defer it or we can differ it. And Jacques Derrida combined those two words in the phrase différence because he wanted to point out that when we are using language, we never actually get to the thing that we're trying to talk about. We can differentiate it or we can defer it. That's what we've got. So when Saussure says that language is a system of differences, he really means both the signifier and the signified are not the same as the referent because they always essentially differ from it. Now we understand why. Why does this matter? Well, it matters because language is integral to our very structure of thought. When we try to think without language, it becomes meaningless. When we try to communicate without using sign systems with other people, it's impossible, right? Think about, for example, facial expressions that you use. That's also a sign system, isn't it? Or hand gestures, or even things like the clothing that you choose to wear. So our world is full of sign systems, but it's really all we've got. And what's remarkable about this is that all of these sign systems work the same way as linguistics. Now, I'll come back to that in a little bit, but first I want to really talk about how language and sign systems in general shape our thought in fundamental ways. Let's take the example of a color. Now, color should be just light waves hitting our eyes, very physical. It shouldn't change from place to place. And yet the problem is, culturally, we define our reality, and language is the major way, sign systems in general are the major way with which we define that reality. What do I mean? Take, for example, the Japanese term ao, which encompasses both blue and green. Now, to English speakers, that's a little strange because for us, those are two different colors. If we have an American under an MRI scanner that's watching how the brain activates, and they see, let's say, something turn from blue to green, then the mind activates at that key moment. It says, aha, something important has happened here. If that same image is being watched by somebody who is native to Japanese culture under that MRI scanner, then that shift from blue to green will not show up a big difference. There'll be some difference, just like we notice shades, but it won't be that moment of saying, aha, something has happened. Now, is that something wrong with the Japanese where they're missing something? Or is this something that Americans have as a special skill because of the way that the language structures it? Let's take another example in the same frame, which is that Russian actually has two different names for the color blue, sini and goluboy, and that's not shades, but those are two different colors. So again, put that Russian underneath the MRI scanner, and when that goes from light blue to dark blue, again, there's that click moment. A certain part of the brain activates, says, this is meaningful. If an American is under that same scanner and it goes from light blue to dark blue, we think, okay, it's a shade, but nothing significant has really changed here. What does this show us? It's a reminder that these differences are cultural constructs. It depends on the language and the culture, language as a representation of that culture that you live in, that shapes what you perceive and whether or not that matters. So this brings us back to the conversation about ethology. We'd like to think that perhaps there's a reality out there, but whatever that reality or that referent really is, it's not as though we simply have access to it. It's filtered through our representational structures, and those representational structures change the reality that we're seeing. Well, for obvious reasons, Plato really did not like this problem with language. And one of the ways that this shows up, although he definitely did not tackle the problem of linguistics or communication in general, he did have opinions about a new technology that was emergent 2,500 years ago, which is the technology of writing. Plato's attitude about writing is suspicion. And you'll recognize that, right? If you think about your grandparents, they're suspicious of new technologies, right? What is this internet thing? Should we really have all these phones? Are we spending too much time in front of the computer, etc.? We have these conversations because each new technology that emerges changes what it means to be human. And Plato underwent that in a really strong way because the shift from oral culture to writing is a dramatic change, right? He was worried that when we start using writing, that we'll replace our memories with that writing. Right? So instead of remembering everything that is really important to us, which Plato thought of as more native or natural to us, more normal, instead, he said, writing is going to take that away from us and externalize that memory. Well, obviously, that's actually true, isn't it? We don't have great memories today. We rely on our phones and writing materials down and sending off emails in order to record a tremendous amount. I, for example, can't even remember my shopping list without writing it down. And I certainly don't remember phone numbers. They're all in my phone, and I rely on that. These simple examples for Plato would have been really important because he wanted you to have internal to yourself a natural sense of reality. Remember, that's his concept of eidos, that you are born with this innate sense of reality. And if you are arguing with somebody else about that reality, you should rely only on that eidos, that native structure. If you start to externalize things in something like writing, then you've done what he calls orphaned your arguments. Okay, so what does he mean by that? When you write something down, it can exist in a time or place without you, right? You might send it away to somebody, or you might pass away as Plato did, and then his writings have been read and reread for thousands of years afterwards, long after he's gone. Well, why is that significant? For Plato, if you're not there to defend your argument, then something really important happens. It's called interpretation. And you and I, in our world today, are awash in a sea of interpretation. Everything around us, we're aware, we are responsible for interpreting. And Plato didn't like that. He wanted arguments, remember, to get to reality. Interpretation and reality are in tension with one another because of the issues of representation that I've been discussing. So this raises a question for us. If Plato was suspicious about writing from the beginning, right, is the concept of memory a more authentic technology than writing in the first place? And for example, memory changes culturally and over time for us, right? I just said that writing changed our relationship to memory, and different cultures remember things differently. And a lot of that has to do with language and linguistic structures as well. Is memory always the same thing? You'll recall that John Locke thought that memory was the foundational structure of subjectivity. We know who we are because we remember who we were yesterday. And yet, how reliable are those memories? Are our memories really things that we use in a detailed way, or do we generalize those representational memories in ways that are functional for us? For example, I know who I am each day, but that doesn't change the fact that my memory of who I am, for example, a long time ago, like when I was 5, actually changes over time. It gets dimmer, and also the way that I represent that to myself and the meaning that it contains will tend to morph as well. That concludes the first part of our discussion about linguistics and the theories around language that developed with Ferdinand de Saussure. We've discovered quite a bit, right? That language is arbitrary, different than its reference, and that therefore, as a system of differences, it actually comprises a cultural phenomenon, right? A cultural way of describing reality, not the reality itself. That representational distance from reality is structurally built into that language, and as a system of differences, it's not something we can simply overcome with more and more communication. The reason that matters so much is it ends up shaping the very ways that our brains experience the world around us, what matters and what doesn't, what shows up as significant and what does not. Now, for the rest of this discussion, I want to extend this conversation about language out into semiotics in general. Semiotics, you'll recall, is sign systems, how sign systems work. Those can be everything from the symbols around us to the meanings that we ascribe to various things. If a student gives a teacher an apple, then that's not the same as an apple sitting on a counter ready to be eaten, right? The way that those meanings shift around and contain variable possibilities is an indication of not only the way that semiotics works, but the way that the differences of semiotics works. So in other words, an apple is not an apple. It depends on the way that we're using it. This matters tremendously for something called intertextuality, the realization that we're awash in a sea of words. So instead of talking about words now or linguistics, I want to shift to semiotics and I want to talk about a text. A text is a metaphor, right? It is the way that we have interwoven words or sign systems that connect with one another. This is a concept that actually predates linguistics and our observations and goes all the way back to an ancient field of study called hermeneutics. This is developed perhaps first by a librarian named Porphyry with the Library of Alexandria in classical antiquity, so the Greek and Roman worlds of the Mediterranean. The Library of Alexandria was probably the most important library in that world at that time. Porphyry was probably the most important intellectual in that community, and his development of the theory of hermeneutics started from his own area of specialty, which was biblical scholarship. He was really interested in what we now call the New Testament. And the New Testament, of course, along with the Bible as a whole, is a combination of many different texts from many different areas, but they all comprise one thing, the Word of God, as Porphyry would have understood that. And this presented him with a really important problem. On the one hand, the Word of God should be absolute truth, not simply our language, which is, as we've seen, relative and distance from reality, but the actual description of reality itself. The problem for Porphyry, of course, is that that's not how the Bible shows up. It's a set of languages, not even the same language, right? We have in the Old Testament or Torah, we have 2,000 years of Hebrew. So that changes and morphs over time. Then we have Aramaic and other forms of Greek. And then that eventually gets translated all together in the Vulgus, the Vulgate Bible, into Latin by St. Jerome. So we have a tremendous amount of linguistic change and shift. And what Porphyry wanted to do was find a system for getting back to the true text as best possible. In order to discover that, he found that he needed to read a lot of other books. Why is that? Well, it's interesting when you're trying to find which text is the right one, right? You have multiple different versions of the Bible, multiple translations, things disagree with each other, and you need to figure out which is the right one. It really helps to be what we now call an historian of language, a linguistic scholar in this particular way, somebody who searches through the roots of language. That's because you can use all kinds of techniques there to find which language is probably the right one for the right text. If in a sermon by Jesus, he uses a word that does not belong in that time and that place, you have to have read enough and be familiar enough with linguistic scholarship to actually be able to know that and recognize it. So he used techniques from this world of languages, intertextuality, the sea of other books and texts that would help him to understand what would be theoretically the truth of God's word. This fact of using one text to define another shows us that intertextuality, that difference of linguistic structures that Saussure observed in the 20th century, actually matters for us much more than just for linguistics, right? It has to do with our concepts of the author, authority, and authenticity. Now, you'll recall that we've already introduced this problem in Chapter 2. We talked about the concept of autos, the notion of the self. Ultimately, linguistic meaning, representational meaning, derives from this notion of authority. And the ultimate authority, once again, for Porphyry would be God in this case. The problem is language actually removes us from that autos, or authority. It's a system of differences and representations, so different than the thing it's representing. And because of that, it doesn't actually give us reality so much as a presentation of what that authorship or authority would be. So not only is this a problem of selfhood as we've introduced it, it's also a problem of the expression or representation of selfhood. Think of it like this. I want to tell you a story about the blind man and the elephant. This is another one of these fables or parables that we've used throughout the class to discuss various problems of meaning. In the blind man and the elephant parable, there are a number of blind men who hear that this strange new animal is coming to town, an elephant, and they're very excited. They all want to see what it is. So they agree that when the elephant gets there, they're all going to check it out. So the elephant arrives one day and they very excitedly go up to it, and one blind man feels one part of the elephant and another feels another. One blind man feels the trunk and says, "Aha, I know what an elephant is. It's just like a snake." Another one feels the foot and says, "Aha, this is quite clearly just like a tree." Another one feels the leathery ear and says, "This feels like a bat's wing. It must be like a bat," and so on. So what are they doing there? They're using their limited perception, which in ethology we've already established is something that we all experience, in order to try to cope with this very large experiential entity, right? For us, that would be our reality. In this case, it's the elephant. And when the blind men come together to compare notes, what do you think they find? Of course, they find that they have different experiences. Is one right and the other wrong? No, they have a limited degree of perception based on their specific experience, right? In effect, what this reminds us of is the fact that we are all limited in our perception. We are all blind to some things. We don't have unlimited or universal perception. Again, that would have been the placeholder for Porphyry of God. But because of this limited perception, we can't necessarily trust even the things that we regard as real. Rather, instead, what we need to do is compare notes. When the blind men compare notes, though, what they find is that they have incompatible concepts of reality. That's because they're reliant on the structure of communication in order to carry that forward. By the way, we live today in a world in which we disagree about a lot of fundamental things in reality. The solution to the blind man and the elephant is not simply to disagree or to say that all realities are relative. That's not at all going to get us anywhere. Think about how that would work for the blind man and the elephant. One would simply say, "It's a snake, and if you disagree with me, I'll kill you," right? Or, "I will never talk to you again." And you cannot have that breakdown in communication. The structure of science that we develop much later on is meant to cope with these kinds of problems, where if I have one perception, I present it to another person in a way that allows them to test that as well. If they can test it and find the same conclusion, then we can start to find points of agreement. And we work through that laborious process precisely because of our limited perception and our uncertainty that what we have is a grasp on total reality. So with that scientific structure, what we do with representation is what I call a form of intellectual modesty. You may think that you have a good hold of reality, and good for you. I'm glad that you do. But don't forget to continuously listen to other people and test your own hypotheses about reality. If you don't do that, regardless of how smart you are, you'll never really grasp the full reality. You need other people, other perceptual worlds. You need to practice comparing your notes to theirs in a way that allows you all to test against falsifiability. And when you do that, when the blind men all come together and they test against each other's observations, what they eventually get is a more full picture of the elephant, isn't it? Right? Maybe they don't get to the entire elephant, but look how much further they get when they compare notes and cooperate. So there's an important lesson in there about the limits of representation, but also the way that we need each other culturally through this process of representation if we're going to move past these problems. So now I'd like for you to consider this foundational problem as we've discussed it. Normally, again, we have this as a group discussion portion, so I'll move a little quicker through this part of the discussion than we normally do. But I want you to think about this quotation, and I want you to keep it in mind as we move into the concluding elements of this lecture. If an object needs a representation, then it is part of that logic that the representation is not its object. But if the representation is different from its object, how can it stand for it truly? Okay. So I want you to consider that as one of the foundational problems, not just of language, but of communication in general, even with ourselves. When we think, again, we think with language and through language. We are linguistic beings through and through. We are sign-making beings through and through. And that's something that's very special and important about what it means to be human. And yet it causes us problems that we really need to take into account. Perhaps no other theorist did a better job of taking these differences into account than Roland Barthes. who was what's called a structuralist and then a post-structuralist, which means that he thought that first language could be summarized through its cultural structures of meaning. And then as post-structuralist, he started to disagree with that and noticed that there were deeper structural or systemic problems as we've talked about them so far. One of his most important observations in post-structuralism is what's called second-order signification. That's a fancy word for saying something actually that we all know about. If you think about a sign, that's composed of a signifier and a signified. And what Saussure observed is that the meaning of that sign can shift from underneath it. And in fact, we do that all the time. Think about a flag, right? If you conceptualize an American flag, it can mean various things, can it? At the level of a sign, it's literally a flag. But then, of course, in terms of meaning, it represents our nation and then other things for us as well, perhaps patriotism, perhaps democracy. But imagine other people having radically different interpretations of that sign as well, right? Perhaps, for example, an American flag flying in a military base in a hostile territory, that people living in that area would see that flag very differently than perhaps you and I would. That's an important distinction. Neither of us is right. What we're really doing there is adding new types of signification or second-order signifiers onto that meaning. The flag itself is still there, but the way that we attach meaning to it, the way that there's a slippage between the signifier and the signified there, is something that we experience a lot. For Roland Barthes, this meant that the concept of authorship or authority was really dead. By which he meant, and this is kind of a dramatic statement to mean something very straightforward, that we're doomed to interpret the world around us. Rather than having truth that we can simply rely on, certainty, instead what we find is that we're awash in a sea of representation, and that those signifying representations have to be interpreted by us. They're not given because they do not express the referent or the reality. I want to give you a concrete example of this concept of second-order signification as we finish up here. I want to talk about an historical figure named Che Guevara. If you're not familiar with him, he was a revolutionary socialist who eventually helped Fidel Castro with the revolution in Cuba, which established the communist regime there. But long before that, he had a more complicated history. He was a doctor by training in Argentina, and as he traveled around Argentina as a doctor, he felt very frustrated because many of the diseases and problems that the people had that he was trying to treat could be prevented by simple things like a little bit more medicine or even shoes to prevent worms and things like that. So these things made him feel that economic equality or justice was going to be foundational to treating people medically. And that led him step by step to embrace Marxist theories of communism that eventually get turned into other forms of communism, what we now call Leninist communism, which is what Fidel Castro practiced. That's a totalitarian dictatorship that Fidel Castro advocated. And so we see a complex shift in Che Guevara's thinking from trying simply to help people, moving all the way into supporting a totalitarian dictatorship that actually took away freedoms from people and in fact even did things that we could not justify in any way, like establishing concentration camps for people who were considered dissident from the communist belief system. But after he died in this revolutionary process in Cuba, he became a kind of a hero and an icon. And when Che became an icon, he was literally turned into an icon as well, a stencil that was easy to reproduce. In the 1960s, the stencil would have been painted on walls and things like that, and of course, turned into a flag. We were talking about the second-order signification of flags and the way that they work. And then in terms of the example that we want to discuss here, it was also turned into a t-shirt, and the Che Guevara t-shirt became kind of a symbolic icon in the United States of people who felt that Che represented values that they wanted: counterculture, revolution, social equality, whatever it is. What you see here, what's happened with Che, is he's gone from a real person who is full of complex differences to a simplified icon. And as an icon, his image was overlaid in second-order signification with all of these other meanings and values that we import onto that otherwise complex set of representations, right? So if you look at the sequence of images here, we go from a real photo of a complex person, right, to something that's increasingly overlaid by the signified of cultural concepts that we want to apply to him. Perhaps Che to you represents nothing at all. Interestingly, by the way, that itself is meaningful, right? If you see an image and it means nothing to you, that's also something that becomes significant for us culturally. What matters to you and what doesn't is an expression of your cultural values, whether you mean it to be or not. So in order to wrap up here, I've included a video by Ted Ed, which does a wonderful job of talking about some of these historical figures that deals with Che in exactly the way I was discussing, as a complex historical figure. Some good, some bad. However you end up feeling about him will be the way that you develop a second-order signification, how you summarize somebody's complex life. We know that our lives are full of difference and complexity. That's true of everybody. But we are doomed to interpretation, and that means that we are always moving through this process of developing signifieds, meanings that we attach to this symbolic world that we live in.